Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar hosted by the LGBTQ Institute at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. This is the first webinar of our virtual symposium dedicated to so-called conversion therapy. And we're going to be focusing on the prevalence and experiences of the survivors, specifically looking at folks in the South, the dangers of this practice, and exploring ways to end it. This series is made possible through a generous sponsorship of Delta Airlines. So we want to thank them for their support. My name is Ryan Romerman, and I am the Executive Director of the LGBTQ Institute here at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. Today, we will be discussing the detrimental impacts of so-called conversion therapy using the findings from the LGBTQ Institute Southern Survey dataset. We will discuss the prevalence, demographics, and mental health of survivors. The discussion focuses on the personal stories, how to recognize this abuse, and how individuals can support those who have gone through this experience. To aid us in the discussion, I will introduce you to our panelists. Dr. Eric Wright, Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Public Health and Chair of the Sociology Department at Georgia State University. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Wright. Madison Higbee, graduate student in sociology at Georgia State University. She received her bachelor's degree, summa cum laude, in sociology this past spring. Samuel Landis, a senior designer at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. Matthew Genslinger, conversion therapy survivor. Miles Markham, impact producer at Multitude Films, an LGBTQ-led independent production company dedicated to telling stories by and about underrepresented voices. And Ashley Robus, doctoral student and counselor, the Education and Practice Program at Georgia State University, and is also one of our LGBTQ Institute fellows. Dr. Wright, I'll turn it over to you to begin the conversation.
Thank you, Ryan. And it's a pleasure to be back with the LGBT Institute again to talk more about the Southern Survey. As Ryan said, I'm the principal investigator of the LGBT Institute Survey along with Ryan. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about the survey. And to give you a brief introduction about the survey, probably the thing that I'm proudest of our survey is it's a very community-based effort. There are a lot of people who are involved, some of which were pictured here at one of our design workshops. In fact, I think it was the first time I met Madison Higbee. She walked into that meeting and suggested we add a couple questions about conversion therapy. But a little bit more about the instrument design. The survey was administered between 2017 and 2018. It was an anonymous survey that was administered through Qualtrics. And as I said, it was completely anonymous and it conformed with all of the normal rules and regulations governing research. The survey had a lot of pieces to it. In fact, it was a lengthy survey and we're very appreciative of the very many people who participated. Today, we're going to be focusing in on primarily the questions that we asked about conversion therapy, and Madison will tell you more about those, but it's a wide-ranging survey, as you can see. The two things I want to sort of emphasize before handing the mic over to Madison is that the survey was, in fact, community-based, and it was a very large sample. In fact, the total sample consists of about 6,500 respondents, which is, I believe, one of the largest samples ever collected of LGBT people living in the South. The major limitation is it is a convenience sample, so we can't say that it is representative information. So the numbers that Madison will be talking a little bit about should be couched in terms of being a convenience sample. But I'm very proud to hand the mic over to Madison, who has just graduated as an undergraduate, and she'll be talking about those results, which, by the way, are also now forthcoming in the Journal of Homosexuality as an article. Madison?
Thank you so much for the introduction, Eric. Hey, everyone. This thesis, as you can tell by its title, focuses on the prevalence and experiences of survivors of conversion therapy in the Southern United States. So for those of you who may not know, conversion therapy is a process that attempts to turn a person, often a non-consenting adolescent, from gay to straight or transgender to cisgender. As you can see, the practice goes by many names, and these are just the obvious ones that can easily be found with a quick Google search or a few clicks through websites like Focus on the Family, a fundamentalist Christian organization that promotes the practice. Although homosexuality has not been considered a mental illness by the American Psychological Association since 1974, and transgender and non-binary identities underwent a similar transition much more recently in 2013, conversion therapy remains legal in most states, including most of the South, and those that have banned it have only banned licensed mental health practitioners from engaging in it. Under the protection of First Amendment rights, many religious leaders and clergy members still practice conversion therapy freely. However, the research to date overwhelmingly demonstrates that conversion therapy does not work and can lead to severe mental health consequences, including but not limited to anxiety, depression, and suicide. There is a lot of diversity around what conversion therapy actually consists of. Most versions of conversion therapy focus only on talk therapy, quote unquote, praying the gay away, or gender role training. However, modern day cases of individuals forced to undergo aversion therapy persist. Through this form of conversion therapy, young people must endure physical punishment, such as electric shocks or induced vomiting, while being shown potentially arousing homoerotic images. This particularly unethical practice conditions them to associate homosexuality with pain. So my paper aims to analyze the prevalence of conversion therapy, what demographic factors might impact the likelihood of a minor being subjected to conversion therapy, and to reaffirm existing research showing that conversion therapy negatively impacts mental health. For my paper, I used data from the LGBTQ Institute Southern Survey, which is a 14-state online survey that was conducted in 2017, and we got a total sample size of, as Eric said earlier, over 6,500 respondents. The Southern Survey was co-created and implemented by Georgia State University and the LGBTQ Institute, and it was created in part to highlight the unique experiences of LGBTQ Southerners, who make up the largest percentage of the LGBTQ population in the United States, yet garner the least representation in academic research on the community. Questions within the survey spanned a wide range of topics, but my paper focuses on the following two questions. We first asked respondents if anyone ever attempted to change their sexual orientation during adolescence, and then inquired whether respondents underwent conversion therapy through a mental health practitioner, religious leader, or someone else. As you can see, there is a significant limitation here in that these questions only ask about sexual orientation and fail to ask about gender identity. As a result, we do not know whether the gender minority respondents who answered yes received sexual orientation change efforts, gender identity conversion efforts, or both. 495 respondents out of 6,502 went through some form of conversion therapy and made up 7.6% of the total sample size. After removing missing data and stratifying the remaining sample size by gender, I ended up with 3,219 cisgender respondents, 332 of which had undergone conversion therapy, and 877 gender minority respondents, 143 of which had undergone conversion therapy. The study includes several limitations. Because we are studying a marginalized and somewhat hidden population, the survey is a sample of convenience, as Eric said earlier, so it's not fully representative of the intersectional experiences of LGBTQ people. The data is skewed across race and education, which means that respondents are much more likely to identify as white and well-educated than the actual LGBTQ population in the South. As a result, people of color and less educated respondents are underrepresented in the data. The survey structure also does not provide the same wealth of information that a qualitative study would allow, and only includes 2 questions about conversion therapy, neither of which ask about gender identity conversion efforts. So this study's results are slightly different based on whether we are looking at the entire sample, just cisgender respondents, or just gender minority respondents. In the total sample, not stratified by gender, respondents who go through conversion therapy as an adolescent are significantly more likely to be younger, transgender, non-binary, lesbian, Hispanic, less educated, and less religious at the time of taking the survey. In the subsample of cisgender respondents, those who go through conversion therapy as an adolescent are significantly more likely to be younger, lesbian, gay, some other sexual orientation besides lesbian, gay, or bisexual, less educated, and less religious at the time of taking the survey. In the subsample of gender minority respondents, those who go through conversion therapy as an adolescent are significantly more likely to be younger, Hispanic, and less religious at the time of taking the survey. Across the total sample, the cisgender subsample and the gender minority subsample, respondents who went through conversion therapy as an adolescent are significantly more likely to experience a serious mental illness. My findings both reaffirm previous literature on the psychological damage conversion therapy can cause and provide new information about the demographics of those who went through conversion therapy as minors. The prevalence and harm of this practice should not be underestimated, especially among LGBTQ youth in the South, an area that has experienced a growing anti-LGBTQ backlash since the legalization of same-sex marriage.
All right. Thank you so much, Madison, for that. That was great. And Dr. Wright as well. And it really helps to set the stage for this discussion to come with our survivors who we have here as panelists. So I wanted to take just a moment to thank you, Sam, Miles, and Matthew, for being willing to share your experiences here today. And it's our hope that through this discussion, viewers of this webinar can better able recognize sexual orientation and gender identity change efforts and learn how we as individuals, personally and professionally, how we can better help those who maybe have gone through this experience or are going through it right now. So thank you for being here, and we're excited to hear from you and learn from you. So I wanted to start out with a general question, just so that we kind of understand who each of you are. I know that Ryan introduced us earlier, but if you could quickly introduce yourself again and just share maybe what some of your experiences in conversion therapy or any sort of change effort was, and just describing like maybe actions that were taken in order to change who you are. In no particular order.
I guess I'll go first. My name is Matthew. Basically, I went through conversion therapy after I came out in high school back in 2006. My mom was she still is very religious. She's Southern Baptist. And she basically sent me to this guy who was advertising as a Christian counselor, but it turns out he was just a life coach. But that's besides the point. Basically, what he was telling me was, because your mom feels this way or believes in this, you should want to make her happy by changing who you love. And so he would send me home with like packets of like 40 pages of like testimonials of people who prayed the gay away. And he was basically like, you can do this if they can do this. So it was one of those things where I was just like, okay, this isn't going to work, because first of all, I'm so focused on my school studies that I don't have time to read 40 pages of testimonials. So after about 4 sessions, I was like, Mom, this isn't going to work. You can't really change like who I am. And we kind of had like an agreement on that. But it was very, it was very straining on our relationship at the time.
Thank you for sharing that.
I guess I'll go ahead and go. Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Landis. I work here at the center actually as the designer. So that's kind of how I'm connected, and I'm really excited that we're doing this program. My experience is a little bit different. I think it's challenging because now you have films like Boy Erased out, which I think are important films, but can sometimes construe that is, the most extreme versions of conversion therapy are the only versions. And mine was not quite as extreme, however, still had an impact on me for sure. I struggled to start to come out fairly early, around 14, 15. And kind of had already, embedded messages that being gay was wrong. I didn't really have any frame of reference for being gay being okay. So I had already, I personally had sought out pastors, my youth pastor, and it was recommended that I try out this therapist who was an ex-lesbian. And I went to some therapy with her for a while, where a lot of the thought was trying to retrain and figure out where my homosexuality entered in, or where it started. And it was really a struggle for me, because I didn't understand why I had to try to work to change something that I never made a decision to have in the first place. And it was also confusing because for most of these organizations, the belief is that it enters in either by, some sexual abuse early on in your life, or an overbearing mother, or a distant father. Some, usually falls in one of those three areas, and I just hadn't really experienced any of those. So it didn't, I didn't feel like I had the reason that I was gay, like that they were trying to prescribe to me. So after a little while, I began drifting away from it. I began looking into other things. I began looking into other gay teen help sites, and looking into other revenues. And my parents kind of found that out, and it alarmed them. They sought out their pastors again and found out about Exodus International, which at the time was the largest international organization. They're kind of like the umbrella organization for a lot of the smaller local organizations. So they have large national large national conferences every year. So it just so happened that it was like a week before the conference. So they were like, we signed you up for this conference. You and your dad are going. So we went, and I was terrified. It actually ended up going much better than I thought, which I think probably was good and bad long term. It was great because in a lot of ways, those were some of the first people that I met that were gay. And so it was like, some of my first community actually. And some of those people are lifelong friends. One friend who I still keep in contact with, and we've kind of gone through the journey of coming out together, and, figuring out what all this means for us. But while I was there at the conference, a lot of the messages were around not so much about behavior change, but around this is not God's best for you. And so you need to pursue celibacy, and hopefully, by doing all these different things, you will, you may become attracted to a woman someday, or a man if you're a woman, so, that's your hope, that's your goal. They don't necessarily promise that, but that was the goal. And so, I did all the things that they told me to do. Distance yourself from, female friends, because you're supposed to see them as romantic. So you want to make sure you have male friends. Of course, none of the male friends understood me, because I was, the kid doing arts and theater, and they were all playing football outside. So that was always challenging. Things like I was, super involved in church. I, read all the different books about trying to figure out where, this had entered into my life. And was in some really, really fundamentalist, youth groups and, organizations, and had varying levels of, pray away type experiences where I had pastors and leaders like pray with me about it, and try to, cast it out in a way, I guess, or change it. And it wasn't really until I went to the last Exodus conference the summer before my senior year, and they announced that they were closing Exodus because the leaders decided that the organization was doing more harm than good, which I think is incredible that they did that. I still am in close contact with Alan Chambers, who is the former president. And I truly believe that from his perspective, he thought, based on his worldview, that he was doing the right thing. And when his mind was changed, he decided to close the organization, which I applaud him for. But one of the things that he said was that 98% of people, or 99% of people, had not experienced change. And so he felt that it was wrong to try and continue this message that people could change. Sadly, there have been lots of other organizations that have popped up in its place. Maybe Miles remembers the names of them. Hope for Wholeness, I believe, is one. I don't remember the names of the others. But that really kind of opened up the door for me that, the next year I went to college here in Atlanta, and it was the first time that I began to meet, LGBT people, and some that were also Christian. And that was, new to me, that you could be gay and Christian, and those two things could coexist together. And the first time that I could come out to people and it not be this huge deal where we'd have hour-long conversations, asking, am I okay? What's the state of my salvation? Things like that. So it really, it's around that time that I met Miles, and got connected to a really great LGBT faith community here in Atlanta. And really began to exploring what it looks like to be more integrated, and that I don't have to change. So yeah, that's, sorry, a little bit longer than maybe you wanted, but it's something that's kind of hard to summarize, I guess.
No, that's actually perfect, Sam. And I would like to hear from you, Miles, as well, but I'm already kind of making connections between the things that you all are sharing. I'm just hearing that maybe there was like you all trusting like a person that was guiding you, whether it be like Matthew, your mom, or Sam, your pastor, but really being like coerced or forced into this sort of change effort. So I wanted to give Miles a chance to answer the question as well, if you want to kind of talk about your experiences and change efforts and types of messages you've received.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Again, my name is Miles Markham, and I grew up between Northwest Florida, Alabama, and South Carolina. And through all of that was brown and queer and transgender. I didn't have all those words for the most part, but as a kid with all those identities, very much absorbed the message culturally that everything that made me different than my white, cisgender, straight peers was disordered. So I converted to evangelical Christianity as a way out of what I thought was a deviant, immoral, and bad lifestyle. And I really believed this message that because Jesus loved me, he wanted to change me, wanted to fix me. So similar to Sam, pursued conversion therapy ideologies on my own. For me, that was ex-gay online ministries. It was books. I went to Bible college, and I attended 12-step support groups offered through my church that were intended to help me overcome or manage what they were calling gender confusion and same-sex attractions. Most of this was peer support talk therapy, but several of the leaders I was meeting with were in grad school to become licensed professional counselors. Some of the messages I received were that what was bringing me to these groups was a spiritual sickness. It came from poor parenting, or it came because women's original sin was desiring to take power and authority from men. It was because I was codependent, or because the devil or the enemy had created these struggles to tempt me and turn me away from God and from my family. Ultimately, all these experiences, I think, were kind of pointing to this idea that all sexual and gender diversity were either deliberate sin or they were a sickness or a disability. And I was taught to start to look at these things from an addiction lens, and that if I continued down the right path with the support and with accountability, then God was going to deliver me. These messages came from family, they came from friends, they came from pastors, from Christian counselors, from Christian professors, and several other kind of mentor figures in my life.
Wow. Thank you all so much for sharing your stories. I even see the chat getting started with folks. I'm appreciative of you sharing those things. I did want to apologize. I forgot to mention before we got started with our panel that we do have a Q&A feature open on this Zoom. So as our panelists are sharing and answering some of the questions, attendees feel free to drop questions in there. And should we have time at the end, we will take some time to address some of those questions. So I wanted to, I also noticed while you all were talking, there were some obviously very detrimental negative parts of change efforts. And then I also heard a little bit of what Sam and Miles were sharing about how there were some positive parts of it in that you found community and maybe support and like-minded people through those processes. And I wanted to, I guess, just have you all share maybe what you felt like was the most difficult part of the change efforts that you experienced. Because as you're talking, I can hear, again, that there are some positive things, but we know that it's a very negative and detrimental experience in terms of mental health and wellness. So if you could just share what you feel like was the most difficult part of the change effort experience that you had.
Sure, I'll go first again. So basically for me, the most difficult part was losing my relationship with my parents pretty much through the process. There was a lot of trust that was broken in the moments that they kind of rejected me. And I didn't go through like a religious like enlightenment, that kind of sounds like Sam and Miles kind of went through. I just kind of shut down. It was more of me losing my religion, losing my faith, feeling more disconnected with my faith because it was a place that I felt like was hurting me in a way. Like praying away the gay to me was a negative thing, like religion. So now I keep like a very safe distance from religion. For me, I get my purpose in life from living in the moment and the love that I receive from my friends and my loved ones. So it kind of changed the way I viewed the world and kind of what I believe in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Matthew.
I guess we could just go in order again. I would agree that it was challenging because it did create this gap, I think, between me and many relationships around me, and it really isolated me because it was this seen as this personal struggle, and there was so much shame around it that it was it wasn't something that people wanted to talk about. I'm thankful that I did have a few key people that I could reach out and talk to, but I think it was really challenging. I agree. I think a trust was broken with my parents and my family, and I'm thankful that we've begun rebuilding that in the past few years, as they've grown and I've grown. There's been some reconciliation there, which I'm thankful for. But I think it's always been hard because of the dissonance for me that like I always knew that anything that either my pastors were doing or my parents were doing was out of love, I think, even as distorted as it may have been. And there may have been some selfish things in there of worry about how it would look for them and how, but I think at the core of it, these were the messages that they were given that this was wrong. And so their most loving response was to help me to, change it or overcome it. So I think it really was just, very confusing and isolating because, and then the struggle with my internal faith too. I grew up very, I was always in church, and my faith was always really important to me. And so it was really hard when the messages that were being told to me that this part of me that I didn't even choose, just because it exists, it distanced me from God. And it distanced me from my faith community, and it distanced me from my family. And so it was just something I always felt like I had to overcompensate for. And so I would say, just that it was always, none of it ever really fully made sense. It was kind of like grasping at straws, and what made the most sense. Let me try this out, I guess, for the moment. But it just never, when Alan Chambers finally did announce that only 99% of people had experienced change from his, experience, that rang true for me. I was like, well, yeah, I've been doing this for 3 years and nothing has changed for me. So it made sense to me. Yeah, I'll let Miles share.
I think for me, spent a lot of years reflecting on this, and what I've come back to is that maybe not the most, but certainly one of the most difficult parts about going through conversion therapy, especially as a teenager and as a young adult, my frontal lobe formation was all done through the fundamental belief that all of the despair and all of the suffering I was experiencing, I deserved. And because that was something I believed for so long and with such a intensity, I really believed for a long time, and I still fight to overcome, this kind of core lie that I, just by virtue of who I am bad for my family, for my friends, for society, everything I cared about. I was under the impression that I would only hurt. And I think anybody in that situation, especially a young person, it's pretty hard to want to live when that's what you think is true about yourself. And so that kind of ultimate outcome of those messages and those practices, again, maybe not even the most difficult, but it was one of the most difficult parts of conversion therapy for me.
Absolutely. Again, there's someone pointed out in the chat that your experiences are different, but there are still some similarities in the things that you all, I guess, took away from it or that resulted from it. I think about Matthew, what you shared about losing a relationship with your parents and kind of wanting to keep that safe distance from religion. Sam spoke about isolation, the shame, like this kind of distorted love type vibe or message that you were getting from those that were meant to care for you, to provide guidance to you. And then Miles, you provided a great segue into our next section. I'm talking about mental health effects, because as we heard from Madison earlier, that those who experience change efforts as an adolescent are significantly more likely to develop mental health challenges and even mental illness. And so I would like for you all to, if you're willing and able to, just talk about maybe some, and Miles, you already touched on this a little bit, but just some of the mental health challenges that have resulted, and that could be something that, was true in the past, or things that you've experienced in the past, or things that are still present with you today, being an adult. So if you can speak to that, just the types of mental health challenges that came from these experiences.
Sure. I think for me personally, feeling that rejection after coming out, and then there's, in my opinion, severe reaction to wanting to change who I am, it kind of put a voice inside my head as a teenager, like, you're not going to be good enough. And it really affected the way that I care for myself, what I believe in myself. I think years of therapy have taught me through self-compassion that it's something that you need to do, especially as an adult healing from this kind of trauma. It's just something that you have to practice, in my opinion. it's not something that's ever going to, in my opinion, go away. It's kind of there with you in the back of your head. And it's just something that you have to learn to live with. And it's one of those things that if you let it get to you, it can consume you in a way. And I'm lucky enough that I have a strong support system outside of my parents to kind of uplift me. And I think that's really important too. But yeah, like the way that I viewed myself after that, like for 6 months after conversion therapy, I didn't even speak to my parents. Like they were still picking me up from school because I couldn't drive at the time, but I was not talking to them. I would eat at the dinner table with them, but I wouldn't even look at them. Like it was basically a severed relationship at the time. And following that, I actually, at one point, I asked my mom, like the first time that I spoke with her, I was like, Mom, I need to go see someone about this. And so she actually let me pick who I wanted to go see as a therapist, which I actually went to see a psychiatrist because I needed to be on antidepressants, because I was just lashing out all the time at my brother for no reason. And it was just my way of coping with the rejection. So it was, it definitely affected my mental health in that way. And now as an adult, I kind of see how maladaptive that behavior was, but I also understand the reaction that I had because of it.
Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, my first panic attack ever was happened when I was supposed to go to another appointment. Sorry, there's yard work going on outside. And I was supposed to go to an appointment, and I, had a panic attack, and it was so severe that we canceled the appointment. I didn't go, and I think my parents kind of freaked out too. And it was soon after that I kind of stopped going to see the therapist. But I think that was like the bubbling up point of mine. I've had panic attacks here and there ever since then. But anxiety is also just something that has always been with me, that I've sought different treatments for, some beneficial, others not so much. And it wasn't really until this summer that I actually finally saw a psychiatrist, and I'm now on medication, and I think able to address some of these things that have been around for a while. Somebody posted in the chat actually about how therapy is something that is put forward as a way to help when you were going through mental health troubles, but that was something that I really struggled with seeking out for a long time because of the trauma. Like I just said a minute ago, I had panic attacks associated with going to this therapist, and so I literally would have panic for a long time when I went to see my first therapist post this experience a year or so ago. And it just took some time of going, and her being really patient, and me just trying to be really gentle with myself. And I'm really thankful for the supportive friends around me who had been in therapy a while and could kind of walk me by the hand through that experience. And I'm really thankful that nowadays there's such that there isn't such a stigma around mental health, and that I'm really thankful because I have such a great group of friends, and so much of my community is in therapy. And so it really destigmatizes going and seeking that help and assistance. And so it pains me to think of people who have gone even, so much longer without seeking out that help. I'm sorry, I think I may have gone off the question. I don't even fully remember.
No, I think you're spot on. You were talking about how change efforts have impacted your mental health, or the types of mental health challenges that you've gone through. So I hear you saying that well, both of you, for Matthew, you spoke about wanting to seek out a corrective therapeutic experience. And then Sam, I hear you like wanting to do that, but like being or having been cautious in the past because of that, rightfully so. So you were, I feel like you were spot on. Was there anything else that you wanted to add to that, Sam?
Well, I guess one other thing is I guess I kind of mentioned briefly the maladaptive or the non-helpful coping mechanisms. Substance abuse and addiction is something that I've kind of struggled with as something that I was introduced to early on in coming out and going to college, and you know, as a way to escape you know, some of these things. And I think I'm thankful over the past year or so I've really gotten to, you know, work on you know, finding more healthy ways of facing those things. But it again breaks my heart, you know, the people that I meet, you know, all have similar stories of going through this experience, and it, you know, you need to find ways to survive and to cope, and you reach out for whatever is in front of you. So yeah, that's just something I wanted to share.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. Similar to Sam and Matthew, for me, mental health challenges abounded and still exist for me, and include similarly depression, anxiety, panic attacks, a lot of despair, hopelessness. For years, I had very aggressive night terrors, which then led to insomnia, which has also manifested as hypersomnia, extreme daytime fatigue, inability to concentrate, to set goals, sometimes to experience my emotions at all. I also physically manifested stomach and mouth ulcers for years, and at one particular point was diagnosed with an autoimmune disorder, which then led to a heart condition, which then led to pigmentation loss. So all of these experiences, it's kind of hard to like pinpoint an origin, but I do know that they became the most pointed and present the years I spent in college, when I was in that 12-step kind of recovery group offered through my church.
Thank you all for sharing. I just feel incredibly grateful to be here and be listening to you all, and just thankful for your vulnerability in this space. It's incredibly inspiring, and just felt the need to interject that there. As I was listening to you all talk, I wanted to also just make note of like my intentional use of the term change efforts. And that's something that Madison touched on a little bit earlier in our presentation. Just calling attention to the fact that there's nothing therapeutic about conversion therapy. And as a mental health professional myself, I'd like to distance myself and my profession from that. But I also understand that some of you might have experiences with licensed mental health professionals who have committed these horrendous acts and change efforts against you. So just wanted to call attention to that, my intentional use of that language, because I think that that's so important. As we kind of wrap up our last two questions here, I would like to kind of combine them. So I see some really, really awesome questions in the Q&A and in the chat, and I definitely want to get to those. But right now I'm interested in if you could give like one piece of practical advice for maybe someone who is going through change efforts right now, or has gone through them in the past and is having a hard time coping with those present day effects. If you have some practical advice for folks going through that. And the flip side of the coin is if there's a way that we as loved ones, as professionals, can support survivors and of change efforts, what would that be? So practical advice for those experiencing it, and ways that loved ones can support.
Sure. Some practical advice that I have is to lean on your support system if you have one. It's very important, even if it's just one person or even if it's just your therapist that you're seeing, just lean on them and really make them part of your support system, make them your new family. It's really important to have someone that can uplift you during these times because it's like the lowest point that I can think of, at least in my life. So it's very important to have a support system. And I know in some cases, it's very hard, especially if you're living in like a rural area or if you're in like a really religious family and all of your friends are in church. Like I know that can be really hard too. But if you can just find one person who is accepting and loving of you and can uplift you, I think that's very important. And then for loved ones and professionals, I think just giving them time and space to really recover and heal from it, because I don't think there's a time limit for that. I wouldn't badger them with questions or like beg them to speak with you because it can be very traumatic bringing it back up, like repetitive trauma. It's almost like a grieving process for me. I feel like I grieved my family members, my parents. So I feel like it's something that's very uncomfortable to talk about. Even now as an adult, even though I've gone through years of therapy, it's still not the most comfortable conversation to have. But I think telling your story and, being this vulnerable about it helps other people who are going through this similar situation.
So if you are the challenging thing is that when you're going through it, you don't necessarily have a scope for the world outside of it. And so, if there is anyone watching, or if you know someone who's watching this that is experiencing this, or their family is talking about things like this, I'm thankful that for social media, like honestly, as harmful as some aspects of social media are now, that we're finding, it was a lifeline for me as a queer kid growing up in Birmingham, Alabama. And the first people that I knew were through Facebook online groups. So there are lots of online support groups that you can find. There's organizations like the Trevor Project, and that you can call and reach out to, and they can help you find resources in your area, hopefully. I would definitely just recommend like looking for, LGBT groups and organizations online that, and see if there are ones that are near to you. Often, most of the biggest cities will have organizations. Reach out to those people and ask them for help and ask them to help you navigate, because you may not have that support network right now. I have a friend who found me through one of the Facebook online groups who's in Texas, and I've been messaging with and trying to get them resources in Dallas. And, I can't be there physically for them, but I can, try and help them navigate that confusing space. So that's what I would recommend for the person experiencing. For people around them, question the adults that are, supporting that they continue this line of treatment. Be a hand that reaches out to them. Like Matthew said, I don't push them on explaining what's happening to you, but let them know that you are a safe space to process that with, if they want that, and offer to help them find other resources that can support them. I am thankful that I had some family members and friends who were those people. And even though I kind of rejected the messages that they were giving, because at the time it was contrary to what I was hearing in other places, like it was confusing because there were people trying to reach out and give me affirming messages that I rejected because it wasn't in line with what I was being told in other places. But just keep reaching out and keep letting them know that that they don't need to change, that they're loved just as they are. Just continue showing up for them as you can.
I really liked what Matthew said earlier about developing self-compassion. I think that it's very easy to underestimate how far-reaching a concept like that can go. And I think in my own experience, somebody actually asked a question in the chat about when, we kind of moved from believing that it was our gender identity or our sexual orientation that was causing these problems to a minority stress model. And for me, it was at the point of realizing that all of the pain I was experiencing was pervasive. It was very common, and it was something an entire group of people had been experiencing for a very long time. And I think I actually had a friend who told me that I was calling myself to a teaching and to a way of living my life that I would never prescribe to another person. And that if I would never ask somebody to suffer the way that I was suffering, what made it morally conscionable for me to continue to suffer in that same way? And so I think a part of offering support then to a person in this experience or fresh out of this experience is not just, completely affirming and saying yes, to all of the beliefs as this person is kind of reflecting and processing out loud, but being able to offer, some interrogation in the direction of cultivating self-compassion, asking this person to reflect on how they believe, it makes sense to treat other people, to treat those who they love and who they value and who they respect, and then turning that around and asking them to reflect on what it would mean to, treat themselves that way. I think that was really huge for me and very practical. That kind of like accountability, creating accountability for self-compassion, self-acceptance, and self-love, and being able to frame those things as a virtue and not a vice, I think were huge for me.
Those are all really powerful. I'm over here taking notes for myself on ways that I can support loved ones, whether it be personally or professionally. So thank you all for sharing those practical tips. I do want to keep the spotlight on you, Miles, just for a second, if we could. There's a question in our Q&A that from Roland, and they ask, can Miles speak to the issues of his intersectionality, that is ethnicity, gender identity, and sexual orientation, and how he experienced conversion therapy? Did conversion therapy speak mostly to gender identity and sexual orientation? How, if at all, did ethnicity factor into the experience? So really getting at like that intersectionality piece, which is important to highlight because, as Madison explained earlier, it's consistent with the data that they found in the Southern Survey.
Sure. Hi, Roland. Yeah, it's a complicated question to answer, but I guess I'll start by saying I am mixed race, and so I am Native Hawaiian, Japanese American, Swedish, German, Irish. And something that I kind of found over the years was that even though in conversion therapy and in these sort of like ex-gay, ex-trans ideologies, there's often a lot of teaching about gender expression and gender performance, and trying to cultivate what they would describe as like biblical manhood or biblical masculinity in a person, or biblical femininity, womanhood, which are all, mind you, white Western conceptions of masculinity and femininity and the performances of those things. And so I found that because I am Asian, I was consistently being hyper feminized, even when I was performing what they would consider biblical manhood, because of how I looked, how I appeared, just what my presence was in a space, because I was being read as ethnically ambiguous and slender, and tall, and all these different things. They were seeing their vision of femininity, and so in that way, that was not policed in me in the way that I saw it being policed in women in this group who were cis and same-sex attracted. And I think I did not become aware of that until after college, and I started thinking a little more deeply, like, about gender and about the ways in which gender theory could inform, my faith. But I know that some of the kind of strategies, or practices or techniques that were employed in these groups that I was a part of, even though they intended to, like, fix sexual orientation, it was all about gender and all about gender identity. And I actually did not learn about being transgender until conversion therapy. That was not a word that I had access to in the communities I was a part of. And the more that I was taught about this sort of, like, core wound, or like women's core sin about trying to take away male power and authority, the more I started to wonder, like, if that's really what was going on for me, was, underneath the same-sex attraction was the gender confusion. And of course, all of these, again, were racialized, but the churches I was a part of did not know that. They didn't realize that their vision, for manhood or womanhood, and their inability to see anything between or beyond that was informed by whiteness. And there's a lot of really interesting and important work that's been done about the way that gender has always been racialized, and how sexism and ultimately misogyny, the hatred of femaleness, the hatred of femininity, femme presentation, all these different things is at the bottom of what we're talking about here. And so I could go on, but I think what I'll say for now is my kind of biggest takeaway from that experience and throughout my life has been that it's impossible for me to parse out when mistreatment, prejudice, or discrimination I'm experiencing has been because of gender, or it's been because of race, or it's been because of both and so my kind of big takeaway from all of that is it's because I kind of live in a middle space. The only response of, like, the dominant culture was to try and push me, into one of any polarities, in any binaries that existed to help people make sense of whatever this was.
Yeah, that's so good. Thank you for sharing that. And I hope that it gave me some insight into, like, the intersectional experience of conversion therapy or change efforts. And so thank you again, Roland, for asking that question. I'm cognizant of time, and I would like to do a quick speed round with you all to end off this panel discussion. And I would like to call attention to Peter's question from the Q&A. So Peter says, I'm a conversion therapy survivor and a suicide attempt survivor. I know that for me, there were several events in my life that showed me that I deserved love from others and myself. Are there any key events that helped you as survivors love yourself again? So if you could just quickly say if there were, like Peter asked if there were any key events that helped you love yourself again.
Yeah, when I was in undergrad and college, I was seeing a therapist who was also part of the LGBT community. So that was very helpful to have someone in the community that is also a helping professional, like kind of help things make sense. Having like a straight, cisgendered person kind of talk you through what they might think you're going through, it's not the same as having someone who might have experienced that themselves. So I think it's kind of important to have a member of the LGBT community as well, as part of your support system, whether it be a therapist or a friend or on like an online community, like Sam was mentioning earlier. So I feel like that was very helpful for me, and it was kind of like a turning point and like, okay, there is hope for me out there as well.
I don't know if I can point to one singular experience. I think it's something, because it was an ongoing traumatic experience that took years. It's ongoing, taking time to heal. It takes continued support from those that love me, and family members and friends. And it takes continued work around self-acceptance and that self-compassion that Miles and Matthew talked about. That's work that I'm still doing now, and I probably will continue doing for a long time. But I think it's worth it, and experiences like this right now make it more meaningful and purposeful. So I'll just say thank you so much to Ryan and Dr. Wright and Madison and Ashley, as well as my co-panelists Matthew and Miles, for joining this important conversation. And I hope that we were able to bring some light to these experiences. So yeah.
I had an experience in 2014 where I went to an LGBTQ film festival in Kansas City and watched a film called Kumuhina. And it's about this cultural teacher and practitioner in Hawaii who has described, her life experiences of being mahu, which in Hawaiian just means middle, and just in an hour and 20 minutes kind of tells the story of how Hawaii was colonized and the way that that changed the gender systems and what role religion played in that. And throughout the film, she's also working with a student who's a young kid, probably 10 or 11 years old, who has sort of like the inverse experience, being assigned female at birth, but is also a middle person. And watching an elder and a teacher, from lineages, that I actually do come from, talk about their own story and talk about, our heritage, and to see them sharing that with another young person. I just remember watching this story and kind of coming undone, in the moment, and being so moved by it, but walking away from it and feeling like, wow, like, not only do I feel like I've seen myself represented in a different way through this film, but like I come, from strong and resilient people, and I have this entire thousands years history, to rest on, and it kind of catalyzed an exploration of my ancestry, and of Hawaiian identity in a way that up until that point I had not experienced. And so I think that was a very pointed moment for me in the journey of self-love and self-compassion.
I really love that, Miles. When you're speaking, it actually reminded me, I think probably every Pride, I kind of have similar experience, and it moves me in a different way of like just seeing all the people, who are out and being proud, and that it's all different types of people, from all different walks of life, and that yet we have this uniting thing behind us, and that, like you said, we are resilient people, and that we are a beautiful people. And so, I mean, I get emotional every time I'm at a Pride parade or in a Pride parade. It's a beautiful experience. thanks for sharing that, Miles. That was really beautiful.
Yes, thank you all for sharing those events that help you to love yourself again. I mean, I want to extend thanks to you again for being here and sharing your stories. From the looks of the chat box, it seems like our attendees have enjoyed it as well. So again, thank you so much for being here and sharing your stories. And at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Ryan with a brief closing announcement.
Yes, I just wanted to thank everyone again, and thank you for sharing your stories, to all of our panelists, to the folks who've worked on the research. We hope to continue this conversation on October 29th, where we're going to be specifically talking about strategies, law, hope, and healing, as we've started to do today. Really a roadmap to ending conversion therapy. Again, that'll be October 29th at 3 p.m. You can register at lgbtq-symposium.org. This particular webinar will be available in about a week online. In addition, there will be resources that we've been collecting from our panelists and others, and we hope that they'll be of use for you. But we do hope that you also spread the word about how important this is, so that way folks can either watch the recording or join us live in 2 weeks. But again, thank you to everyone who was willing to share their story and be vulnerable with us, and we hope to see you in 2 weeks. Thank you so much.